So I'm very happy to have Ritchie Tejana here with us today. He's a CPA lawyer practicing for more than 10 years and also a professor at the University of San Carlos. Ritchie, thank you very much for being here with us today.
It's my pleasure, John, to be part of your YouTube channel.
Thank you so much. So I was part of a couple of other vlog interviews myself, and I mentioned that my Purple Cow agency company here in the Philippines was structured as a one-person corporation or as an OPC, and a lot of you sent me messages saying that you would like to find out more about the OPC and what it's about. I'm obviously not an attorney, and so I wanted to get an expert here that would share with us more about this important legal structure here in the Philippines. So attorney, can you tell us how long has the OPC been available here in the Philippines?
Yeah. Well, actually, this one-person corporation is entirely a new concept in the Philippine legal system. It's only been introduced during the first quarter of 2019 when the revised corporation code took effect.
Okay. And is the OPC available for everybody or only certain people?
Well, actually, any natural person of legal age, whether he's a Filipino or a foreigner, he or she can form a one-person corporation. Even trust or estates are allowed to form a corporation. However, the law specifically prohibits banks, pre-need companies, insurance companies, financial institutions, and even persons whose purpose is to practice their profession. They are not allowed to form a one-person corporation.
Okay, makes sense. What about before the OPC? What legal structures were open for foreigners if they wanted to start a business in the Philippines?
Well, prior to the OPC being introduced into the Philippine legal system, there are only a limited number of choices or structures available for foreigners. Foreigners or foreign corporations can only form partnerships, corporations, at least 5 incorporators, or foreign corporations may set up a Philippine branch office here in the Philippines.
Okay. So I have to say, informally, I would hear before about some situations where it seemed like the foreigner was the owner, but then there would be Filipinos somewhat on paper to get things started. What was going on in the past with that?
Yeah, the foreigners before were actually constrained, or they have no choice but to bring over 3 Filipinos, whether they know them personally or not.
Sure.
Or maybe these are just acquaintances, in order to comply with the minimum requirements of the corporation code before it was revised.
Right.
Because the corporation code before requires that for a corporation to be formed, you must have at least 5 incorporators. So if you have only 1 foreigner, then you have to bring in at least 4 other members for you to be able to form a corporation.
Okay. So the one-person corporation, at least for me, seemed a great option to start my company here, but is there any other reasons why a foreigner might want to consider a different legal structure when starting a business in the Philippines?
Yeah. Well, if starting a legal structure in the Philippines, then if you want to have full control of your business, then I would suggest that you form a one-person corporation, because this is the problem before. Foreigners in the previous, before the OPC was introduced, were constrained to bring over 4 other members who have controlling interests. And it turns out that the foreigner who is infusing capital, who really owns substantially the corporation, has no control over his business. And it's the Filipinos who have minimal or no infusion of capital at all who controls the business. So unlike in a one-person corporation, the foreigner can have full control of his business.
Okay. And then what about in terms of documents or procedures? Say someone watching today says, sounds like a great idea to me, but I have no idea where to start. Of course, they're going to want to get in touch with yourself, and I'll make sure and leave your contact information in the description below. But can you give people listening a big picture sense of kind of documents and where they would need to start to learn more to start this process?
Yeah, sure. In forming a one-person corporation, the SEC has introduced a online company registration system. So most lawyers and practicing professionals get to access this website of the SEC, and in that website actually, or in that system of the Securities and Exchange Commission, you'll be needing a lot of documents, at least 5 documents actually. You have a cover sheet, you have an articles of incorporation, you have also a consent letter from your nominee and alternate nominee. You also need to fill up a Foreign Investment Act form, which is a specific form of the SEC. And you'll need to provide your TIN if you're a Filipino, or tax identification number and or passport number if you're a foreigner.
Okay. So I remember when I filled this out, I had to fill out some things that seemed as if the Philippines government was giving that straight to the US government for things like taxes. Did I understand that right at the time?
Yes. After the one-person corporation is registered with the SEC, it also needs to be registered with the Bureau of Internal Revenue here. You also need to secure a local business permit for you to operate legally in the local government unit where the business will be situated. And also, if the corporation intends to hire employees, then you need to register your business with the Social Security System, with the PhilHealth Corporation, and with the Home Development Fund, or the Pag-ibig.
Okay. And how long might someone expect for the process from beginning to end take as kind of a range?
Well, it usually depends on the review. What takes so long is the review of the SEC lawyers. The fastest that I had was after the SEC lawyer has reviewed, from the time that we submitted the documents online, up to the time that the certificate of incorporation is released by the SEC, it took me 3 weeks.
Okay, that's very fast.
Yeah.
Yeah, but maybe that was a small miracle. What is maybe the longest that it's taken as well?
The longest is around 1.5 months. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. I have to say, when we started and we were told that we were the first, or certainly I know one of the first in Cebu, it took quite a bit longer than that, but we set ours up in 2019, not long after it was available. And at the time, banks and others were still somewhat unaware of the OPC. So what do you find now? Do you think that most banks and other institutions are now comfortable with the OPC and aware that it's out there, or is it still something new for them?
Yeah, based on my experience, there are still quite a number of banks and other institutions who are not yet so familiar with the one-person corporation. They still require board of directors resolution, when in fact, in a one-person corporation, the single stockholder is also the sole director and president.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But it seems that there's still one or two others that need to have their name, or is that not the case?
But the name of the corporation?
That are on the paperwork, or is it only the person that signs up to it that needs to be on the paperwork?
Well, in the articles of incorporation, aside from the single stockholder, you also need to have the treasurer to sign on that articles of incorporation.
Okay. Is the person that owns the OPC able to be the treasurer as well, or does that need to be a separate person?
Yeah, the single stockholder has the option to be the treasurer himself, or designate another person to be the treasurer. But if the single stockholder decides or opts to have himself as the treasurer at the same time, he needs to put up a bond with the SEC.
Okay, thank you. So with a lot of other corporations where it's only one person, for example, a sole proprietorship, it seems that there's a lot of liability for the person that owns that. But what about with the one-person corporation? Is there any extra protection for people that have that compared to a sole proprietorship?
Yes, actually, this is one very good feature of the one-person corporation, because unlike a sole proprietorship, wherein the personal assets of the owner is liable to pay off the debts, here a one-person corporation, similar to the same as other corporations, enjoys this limited liability. It means that his liability is only limited to his investment or his capital investment in the corporation.
Okay. Very, very good. What about taxes? I know a lot of people are thinking, if I have a company in the Philippines, will I have to pay taxes there? If I'm paying taxes in the Philippines, do I also need to pay that in the country where I'm from? Does that depend on where somebody's from? How do taxes work with the OPC?
Yes. For foreigners, for example, if whether it's a foreigner or a foreign corporation, for as long as the general concept of for taxation is that for as long as you are earning income here in the Philippines, it will be taxed for any income tax, any income earned within the Philippines. For a foreigner in his individual capacity, if he earns income here in the Philippines, it will be taxable here in the Philippines, but not the income he earned abroad. But for a one-person corporation, since it is considered as a domestic corporation, since it is organized here in the Philippines, then its income within the Philippines and even outside the Philippines are all taxed.
Okay. Okay. And is there a tax range with the OPC, or does that really depend on what people make? How does that work?
Yeah, unlike a natural person or an individual wherein there is a range, the tax rate right now it ranges from 15 to 35%. In an OPC, we just had a new law, the CREATE law, Corporate Recovery and Tax Incentives Enterprise Act. It rationalizes the tax incentives and reduces the income tax. So it also benefits the one-person corporation. The tax right now for corporations, including a one-person corporation, is reduced from 30% to 20%.
Okay, that's a significant drop.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Was that motivated, do you think, by the pandemic or other reasons, or hard to say?
Yeah, it's actually motivated by the pandemic. It's a way of the government to help corporations and other businesses recover from the effects of the pandemic.
That's great. Yeah, that's very positive. What about in terms of the cost of setting up an OPC? I'm sure there's some paperwork cost. Do you know roughly what that is, as well as is there any other costs that you need to invest into the company to be able to start it?
Yes. If for informing a one-person corporation, insofar as the SEC is concerned, you only need to pay filing fees. So the filing fees is 1/2 of 1% of the authorized capital stock. Then you also need to pay 1% of the registration fee as legal research fee, and then you also need to pay for the Foreign Investment Act application. That's the FIA application. That's only 3,000 pesos. And then documentary stamp tax.
$60 US.
Yes, $60. And then documentary stamp tax. That's only 30 to 50 pesos.
Okay.
Yeah.
About $1 or so US.
Yes.
That's great. And then you mentioned another amount. So does that depend on how much is invested into something particular in the business? I didn't quite understand how that part of it works.
Yeah, the 1/2 of 1% it's based on the authorized capital. So it's actually based on how much money you put in to your business.
Okay. And does that mean to start it, for example, overhead or something different?
Yeah, it's actually the initial capital that you because in filling up the articles of incorporation, you are required to state there how much is your authorized capital or initial capital that you will put up or infuse into the business.
Okay. So does that mean, practically speaking, if you were to start a restaurant and it cost 500,000 pesos to start, that would be your initial capital? Is that what's meant by that, practically speaking?
Yeah, it actually depends on, it could be more, but that's the minimum amount for you to operate.
Okay, very helpful. Well, I know we've covered a number of topics that others asked me. Is there anything else that you could think of that we haven't covered that would be important for people to know about the OPC or doing business in the Philippines?
Yeah, well, in the Philippines, I encourage Filipinos and other foreigners to take advantage of this new concept introduced into the legal system by shifting your businesses into a one-person corporation, because aside from the limited liability advantage. You can actually you can protect your personal assets. You can just invest so much assets or so much capital to your one-person corporation, and then your personal assets will not be touched, even garnished by the BIR. Because what happens to other businesses, if you're a sole proprietorship, the BIR can garnish even your personal assets, even your personal bank accounts. But if you are into a one-person corporation, the BIR, if supposing in the worst case that there is a tax evasion case against the corporation, the BIR can only freeze or garnish the bank accounts of the corporation, but never your personal bank accounts. That's what happened to Manny Pacquiao. Yeah,
Really?
because when there is a tax evasion case filed by the BIR against him, all his bank accounts, personal bank accounts, were frozen by the BIR.
Wow.
Yeah, so when you have an OPC, you can protect your personal assets.
That's really great to know. For those of you in the US, the BIR is the equivalent of the IRS, or other bodies in other countries dealing with tax. So
it's a tax authority in the Philippines.
yes, that's a great safeguard for those that have an OPC.
And also in terms of taxes, if you are an individual, your taxes will range between 15% to as high as 35%. But if you are an OPC, you'll only be paying a straight amount or fixed rate of 20% of your taxable income.
Okay. So does that also mean that it can't be lower than 20%?
Yeah, it can't be lower than 20%. For as long as you have a taxable income, the tax rate now is reduced from 30 to 20%.
Okay, good.
But if you are registered with the Philippine Economic Zone Authority, or PEZA, or under the Board of Investments, the BOI, you can enjoy actually income tax holiday, 0% for a certain number of years, 4 years, 7 years. Then after that, you can just be paying 5% on your gross income tax.
Yeah. It's very good. So I have a feeling that those listening would also be really interested to hear about PEZA, especially when they hear some of the tax benefits with that. So if you would be willing, I'd love to have you on the channel at a future time to talk about PEZA as well.
Yeah, sure. I'd be willing to share my knowledge about PEZA registration or BOI registration and its incentives and advantages.
Sounds great. I look forward to that. Well, Ritchie, it's been a pleasure having you on the channel today. For those of you watching, I'm going to put Ritchie's contact information below if you need legal help. He comes highly recommended from others that I've spoken with, and I look forward to your comments below, and if we're lucky, Ritchie might jump in there and help us answer some of those as well. As always, thank you for taking time to watch, and take care.